going to welcome everybody. And Daryl Van Tongeren, my friend and the author of Done, a book that has already been teaching me so much. I can't wait to actually dive into some of the nuances. Interintellect is an events platform for artists and intellectuals, but we also have a very tight-knit community tier where people who live for discussing ideas with people from all over the world join, and they do just that. One of the things that we're often discussing is, how difficult it is to find the right role of religion in one's life. Many interintellect people grew up religious and left later. Some later went back on their own terms, so they needed that distance to kind of renegotiate their relationships with religion. We have people who grew up without any kind of religion, and they found something that calls to them spiritually later in life. We have people who switch religions midway, and we also have people who are completely agnostic and they have maybe an intellectual interest in religion or a neurological one or a historical one, but it's not something that is kind of cutting close to the bone for them personally, or not yet, or not, maybe this is not something that awaits them. So there's a lot of nuance to this in our community and also to your book. I'm so grateful to you that you wrote it and that we get to learn from you what comes after religion. Do you mind maybe just saying a few words about your work, the book, the work you do with your wife and colleague, and also Done? A little bit maybe dwelling on what Done even means. After this, I'm going to open the floor, and I really would like to hear from everybody before we go further into the conversation, so that Daryl will introduce himself, and so do we, and we also will share where we're coming from into this conversation to ensure that it goes in directions that satisfy your curiosity and allows you to share your own points of view. Does it sound okay? Let's do it. Daryl, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much, and welcome to Interintellect.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks to all of you for engaging in this conversation. So I'm Daryl Van Tongeren. I'm a social psychologist at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. So this book was born out of a research program that my colleagues and I undertook about 6 or 7 years ago that was funded by various grants, and really is kind of our best estimate at one of the first empirical or data-driven or scientific books on leaving religion. So a lot of books on leaving religion are personal memoirs, right? Narratives of people saying, here's what happened to me, here's what I experienced. We really wanted to capture a wide range of people's experiences using the best social scientific data that we can. So where, this book kind of straddles between social science and kind of practical application or help. So my sense is it's written for people who have either are rethinking their religious beliefs or who have left religion, or are loved ones with people who have undergone some type of religious change. And they kind of want to understand psychologically, socially, what's going on. The term done, it's a bit of a play on words. So a lot of research has focused on the religious nuns. So not the ones with like the black, habit and, the ruler in Catholic school, but the nuns in terms of, what's your religious affiliation? And they say none. And everyone's been talking about like the rise of the nuns. My colleagues and I figured, well, at least some of these nuns have to have at least been one time religious. And so maybe are they religious dones, right? They're just kind of done with religion. And so that's where the idea comes from, is kind of looking at religious dones, people who are done with religion. And so walking through like, why do people leave religion? What's the process of leaving religion? What's the consequences after? How do you find an identity, navigate relationships, and find flourishing with or without religion, whether you come back to it or whether you stay away? So that's the bird's eye view. That's me, but I'd love to hear more from the rest of y'all.
Thank you so much. And I'm so happy that you mentioned the keyword, I think, here, which is flourishing. Because obviously we all here want our fellow humans to find their way of flourishing. And there might be very different routes that individuals can take there. For some, they need to have a religious life in order to be feeling flourishing. For others, they need to be as far removed from any religious organization as humanly possible to feel whole and loved, and that they are contributing society. And I'm so glad that you, and I mean, just the design of your book also, there is something in the whole, the coloring and the build of the book and how it's structured, that to me is very strongly probing the question of happiness, right? Whenever we're talking about great changes in life, be that, leaving of a religion, leaving of a person, leaving of a place, a job, those big, or losing somebody, right? Like those are the great big division lines that run across our lives. And the first thing that, pops to mind is, how will this person be able to flourish again? How will this person find happiness again? And very often, I think this is why it's so beautiful to me that, you and your colleagues have identified the many recurring symptoms or problems that ex-religious people will be facing, even if you kind of like control for all other factors as being different. That there is a specific, the way immigrants or divorcees or people who grow up without a parent will have some typical problem that it's worth understanding, it's worth having a statistical understanding of it, because it's similar. But unlike grief or divorce, leaving a religion often feels like happiness at first. And so there is this double-edged sword here, right? Where some of the negative consequences might surprise you. Maybe you are exhilarated at first. It's extremely liberating. And it's only later, maybe years later, maybe facing your first great crisis after having left religion, when you might find yourself being without the tools that you used to have. And then where do you turn? What is the outside dogma, outside religious community, where do we find those things, right? Which maybe atheists are dealing with these problems from day one, but for many ex-religious people, the first time they face these existential crises are later down the road. If anybody's not happy with doing an intro, you're very welcome to opt out. If not, I'm just going to go around the room and call upon people, if that's okay, and just tell us who you are, where you're calling in from, what made you join this conversation, and anything about your personal religious history that you're willing to share or you're happy to share. I will go last, and I will fully participate in the intro as well myself. Shahid, are you happy to start as a veteran Interintellect host yourself?
Sure.
Religious themed salons?
Yes. Hey everyone. Hey Anna. Hey. Thanks for joining us, Daryl. I'm halfway through your book, and I'm been really enjoying it so far. So happy we could have this discussion. My name is Shahid. I live in New York City. And after having read your book, if basically identify as a religious done, I think, or at least a soft flavor of it. I grew up Muslim, and I kind of questioned a lot of things over my teens and early 20s, and how I would describe myself now is some, ambiguous sort of flavor of agnostic, some sense of, I do think there is a God out there, but I think that God looks very different from what was taught to me, almost an impersonal and like non-deterministic notion of God. And so something that's been on my mind a lot the past couple of years, and something that I've posted a few salons on, is the notion of community and how and what that means, like what a post-religious community means, because I think religion, for all of its like critique and flaws, I think it does the social infrastructure of community probably better than anything else. And so to your point, like when folks leave, or at least begin to question certain things, there's a loss of community, and there's maybe a loss of like support structures in that same sense. A related idea I've been toying with too is just like um like in Judaism, the notion of being a cultural Jew or an agnostic Jew is pretty well established, and I almost selfishly want that to be a thing for former Muslims as well. Some sense of maybe we don't believe in theology so much, but the certain cultural elements still have value. So yeah, I just want to sort of share a couple of things in my mind, and again, happy to be here. Thanks for joining us.
I mean, cultural Christianity is such an interesting thing. We had an event, and I'm going to plug it in here because we also have another event coming up with Nadia Williams about cultural Christianity and how, like, for a variety of different reasons, being a cultural Muslim or a cultural Jew or a cultural Christian mean very different things. And every religion has its own version of kind of half-assing it, but it's a very, very different one from the other. We can go into that. Daryl, do you have any notes on like the people who leave a religion, but they become culturally that religion, and what is that really leaving the religion? Does that really change the picture from a psychological
Yeah,
point?
well, no, I mean, one thing that I love that you said, Shahid, was that you're a flavor of a done, right? Like you're reading it and you're like, well, I'm probably a done, maybe I'm a soft done. And one thing that I do talk about is there are different degrees of being done, right? Like done can mean lots of different things because religion has lots of different components, right? So religion has beliefs that we may or may no longer ascribe to. They have emotional components that we may or may not connect with the divine or transcendent anymore. They have these moral rules that we may or may not follow anymore. And then there's the social component, which we may or may not belong to a community anymore. And so, some people may leave the community because they don't feel like they fit anymore, or they don't agree with the community, but maybe they retain some of their emotional connection, or maybe they jettison their beliefs, but they they really kind of still try to connect with nature or something greater than themselves. And so I really appreciate, first of all, your vulnerability in sharing that, but then also just kind of highlighting that you can be done in different ways, and being done for one person could mean be something very different than another person being done. And so it's really, really valuable to kind of understand what each person means by that. The second thing that I love that you said is like religion kind of nails the community, right? Like that's one thing that they kind of do pretty well, especially if you were raised in a high cost or high investment religious community. Like I talked to a lot of people who were raised in evangelical Christian fundamentalism, and they say, gosh, that was really tough, but those people, they do anything for me, right? Like I was at church multiple times per week, but if someone was sick, they came with a casserole, or it's really hard to replicate that. And so a lot of people actually have said, one of the things they miss the most after leaving religion is the community. And they wish that they could replicate that in some way, and they haven't yet figured out how to do that. So I really appreciate what you shared.
Whenever I'm in the US, I mean, now I'm based here, but whenever I used to visit, and somebody who grew up Mormon or in a military, as a military brat, I would immediately interview them because I always feel that they know something about community building. That is my job, basically. But that people who, I mean, there's something like American about it, and something, or maybe something about like new countries, right? I'm sure you would find some kind of equivalent in Australia, Canada, et cetera, et cetera. If you're born into the middle of Rome, you might feel that you want to improve on your community and the politics, whatever societal problem that you happen upon, but you would have to be insane to think that you're building anything from scratch in Rome. Like, that community has been there for thousands and thousands of years. And India is a bit different, right? Because India is also extremely old, but nevertheless, it's one of the cradles of new communities, et cetera, et cetera. But in America, you have a tradition of people who had to figure out how to build extremely close-knit communities relatively recently. And we have kind of the paper trail there. You can see what they were doing, what worked, what didn't work. And oftentimes they do feel stronger. If your community is being held together by the sheer will of individuals every day, then that will be strong, because all of those instances where it wasn't strong, the community is no longer there to be observed. So that's a very, very interesting note. And whilst Interintellect is a completely secular community, there is a pastoral element to it, and we can, I mean, I would love to hear from the members here, but there are so many marriages, babies, books co-written, people moving to another continent to be with the other, like there's a depth to it, which signals trust. And it's because it's relatively high buy-in. Like if you don't participate in the community, if you're not there, then people eventually, you might not even know the new people because they haven't seen you yet. And so I really, really love this kind of high threshold into high commitment note. Katrina, do you want to go next? Talk about OG members.
Hi.
How are
Hello.
you doing? So
I'm
great.
doing so good. I am so excited about this topic.
Engagements.
Oh yeah, thank you. I'm gonna bring that up as part of my answer actually, but so I am Katrina. I'm from Los Angeles. And the reason I'm interested in this topic is I grew up Catholic. I went to up to through college, Catholic school, went to Catholic church. I'm Filipino. It's like deeply imbued in also just my family and my culture. And since college, I basically stopped going to Catholic church. I spoke with my family and I said I'm no longer Catholic. And that was like one of the big decisions was I realized I didn't really believe in heaven and hell at my core. And I was like, well, I can't really continue following this religion. I don't really want to piecemeal some of the core tenets of being like Catholic, especially. So I've kind of been floating around with no real like religious identity. However, I feel like I have tools from different sort of toolboxes like modern psychology, or I have my local community, like all these things and needs that I feel like sometimes religion is like the one-stop shop for. So I feel happy and I feel in integrity. I just don't have like any titles for things. And I don't feel I necessarily need a title for things, but this situation came up where I got engaged, and which is really exciting. And then it begs to question, it's like, well, how do we do this? You know, in light of, I don't feel like I have tradition, or I don't know what I consider like sacred and rooted and authentic as far as something celebrating like matrimony. And my partner has been to many like non-religious weddings, and he's like, we'll find a friend, or like we'll find, you know, something. I just went to a wedding where they did like a Hawaiian wedding, but they like are now living in Hawaii and are taking in that culture, and it felt very authentic. But it's bringing to mind these questions of like, how do I want to celebrate into something sacred when I really left what that was for me as a child? And how do I redefine this for myself? And how do I redefine this within my wedding? So yeah, pretty much that's where I'm at. And so I'm really excited about this topic today.
Daryl, is there a typical answer to how to help newlyweds?
Oh gosh, man, I'd have to. I'm not a clinical therapist, otherwise, we could get you set up. I think what you highlight is kind of two things. One is religion is kind of comprehensive, right? Like you mentioned it perfectly. It's like the one-stop shop, right? So it's kind of like, um, you know, some people say like, well, it's kind of like saying, well, hurricanes are nothing but like rain and storm surge and tidal waves and strong winds. And it's like, well, that's true, and we can kind of pick apart religion the same way, but a hurricane is all those things, and kind of like religion is all those things together. So that package deal is kind of appealing to some people. I think the other thing is, and you mentioned it, that the kind of the getting invested in a particular culture helps extend across generations and feel connected to traditions or rituals. I think one of the things that religion does is it offers tradition, and I know that's a really loaded word. For some people, the word tradition is kind of value negative. For some, it's value positive. And one of the things that tradition does do is it does connect people across generations, like in the past, with an overarching narrative, right? And so if there are traditions, sometimes those can be thought of as ways of communicating wisdom across generations, and engaging in rituals are ways to kind of embody those traditions. And that can feel very existentially anchoring. And so when we don't have those, yeah, I mean, maybe it's an opportunity exactly to choose new traditions. I mean, and people do this. I love that comment in the chat. People do this every time, often in healthy relationships or healthy marriages. They decide like, well, what are we going to bring in from my tradition? What are we going to bring in from yours? When are we going to like move that together? So, I mean, this is kind of a goofy example, but I was raised where you always open, both of my family and my wife's family celebrate Christmas, and my family, you would open the Christmas gifts on Christmas Eve. And my wife's family, you open the Christmas gifts on Christmas morning. And we both thought like, why on earth would you ever do it any way than the way I was raised? Like, I don't want to wait one more night. Like, I don't believe in Santa anyway. Like, just give me the gifts. And she's like, oh no, there's this whole thing, you know, you make cinnamon rolls. So anyway, you kind of have to come together and say, like, well,
Kind of people, what kind of barbarians open it the next day, right? Like it becomes
exactly.
a person question.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like I want it that night. So kind of coming together and forming, well, what are the traditions that are going to be like kind of moving from me to we, right? What are going to be our shared traditions? And maybe in the same way you can kind of think about, well, what was the spiritual legacy I was handed, the spiritual inheritance I was handed, and then what do I want to keep and what do I want to you know, so my wife is a therapist and she works with clients undergoing religious change. And what she tells her clients is think about, what do you want to keep? What do you want to recycle? And what do you want to throw away? And her framework on that, I think, is so helpful. So keep is like, yeah, I like that. Maybe I think about it in a different way, but I'm keeping that. Recycle is we have to reuse it in a totally different way, but I liked the general gist of the spiritual idea. And then throw away is like, yeah, this just doesn't fit with me anymore. And so I think maybe that lens kind of like in the same way you clean out a closet, kind of moving through your spiritual inventory in the same way.
I love that. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to hearing what how your wedding will be eventually and what you will keep, recycle, or leave behind. We did a good life themed dinner here I'm in DC last night, and there were so many people, and at some point we really ended up talking about religion. It just came up naturally, and this idea, and multiple people mentioned it, you know, Indians, Muslim members, currently Christian, ex-Christian members, and you know, many of them feel that one of the reasons why, you know, marriage rates and fertility rates are lowering is because without religion, many people don't see the purpose, or they don't know how to even think about it. And in their confusion, they just end up not doing it because they just don't feel comfortable. They don't feel that they have the certainty. And it was really interesting. I happen to some degree agree with this. And there was this beautiful discourse there where people were not calling for reconversion. It's not like, oh, everybody should go back to believing in heaven and hell or whatever, but nevertheless acknowledging the problem and understanding the kind of intellectual crisis that this causes to people, even to an individual, then to a couple or a family. When it's multiple crises together, it can get very complicated. And I really love this idea of like create your own tradition, like be a clan, even if you're a clan of one, and make your own rituals and traditions, and then that's you. I think there's something beautiful to this. Colby, do you want to go next? I saw that you made some comments in the chat as well. If you want to go back to that or start from scratch.
Oh, yeah, no, not at all. Happy to be here. It's funny that the school of life's come up a couple of times. I was beside chatting with Katrina, but we used the book How to Get Married from them when I did my wedding ceremony, and it was like a very good. I just felt like they had a very positive framework of like a wedding ceremony as something that has like weight and matters, but in a secular framework. I've appreciated them over the years. But my background grew up, very, I would say like evangelical Catholic, kind of a weird world of like mix of charismatic renewal and also like really traditional Latin Mass Catholic in the US, which is just a very strange combo of things. But spent a few years in seminary studying to be a Catholic priest out of college, and then left that in my mid-20s, left seminary, basically kind of, I'd say like intellected my way out of belief. And so that put me on a really kind of strange path for the past, I mean, that was about 10 years ago now, that a lot of grappling of just like, what do I believe? What do I want to be? What do I want to do? It was a very existentially angsty time period for a really long time that I can't say really resolved in any way, but time has kind of mellowed is actually like the best thing that I could say for me personally. It wasn't quite I'm leaving and I have relief. It was, I am mourning the fact that I'm leaving something that has been good, but I can't like cause myself to believe. And what I found a lot of people, yeah, at least in that era, it was a lot of kind of like, I'm leaving for very like kind of non-pejoratively, just like very postmodern. It kind of became this like, I'm leaving religion to then go be really woke, was a lot of like people. I don't know anybody here, but anyway, there was a lot of that, and I just did not relate to that at all. And so I had kind of a weird time period of trying to figure out places that I could like respect intellect and respect knowledge and respect the idea of tradition mattering and belief being a good thing, even if I personally like can't assent to it. So yeah, that's kind of some background. Right now I don't really practice anything at all, but still have a lot of tentacles in me just from history and friends and family and everything else that I've been a part of for most of my life. So I just find the topic fascinating, and yeah, really interested to hear what we talk about.
Colby, I love that. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for your vulnerability as well. All three of you all are so vulnerable. Grateful, because I think this gives us a lot to work with. You said a few things that really just kind of resonate with a lot of people's experiences. So I love that you said, like the tentacles of religion, and then you also said like over time it would fade. So one of like the major findings in our research was something that we call religious residue. So the idea of religious residue is after you leave religion, religion sticks with you. So you're the way you think, the way you feel, the way you behave, all of those kind of aspects of religion persist even after people leave religion. That's kind of like, for some people, that's both bad news and good news. Like the bad news is like, oh, I wish I could just walk away. But the good news is realizing, oh, it's not just me, right? It's hard to walk away because religion is just so sticky. We also found that it does decay over time. Like you said, like with time, it does kind of get a little bit easier, right? You're not as ritualized to think or behave in the same types of ways you were as when you were religious. I also really appreciate that you said that there was like an existential component to walking away from religion. So one of the things I think religion maybe does better than anything is it checks all these existential boxes. So like the big questions of life, like who am I? What's the meaning of life? What happens after I die? Religion has like pretty good answers, or it has answers for all of those things. And so after people leave, I think they're uniquely predisposed to existential anxiety in ways that people who have never been religious aren't. And here's what I mean. Let's say you were raised religious and believing in the afterlife and you lost a loved one. You probably comforted yourself thinking, well, that person is likely experiencing this afterlife in which I believe. If you no longer believe in the afterlife and have left religion, first of all, you might be re-grieving that loved one because you realize that that person is gone with finality now. Also, all your answers to existential questions, which you knew and which were super comforting, you no longer have. And so it's not just you've never had them, you're actually feeling their absence, right? Like there's this great, Jean-Paul Sartre kind of had this story about waiting in a coffee shop for somebody. I can't remember the guy's name. And as he's waiting for this guy, he feels the absence of this guy. So it's very different than like dining alone. Like if you dine alone, it's like, I'm just eating by myself, right? You're just drinking your beer and eating your chili. But if you're waiting for someone, you actually can feel their absence. So in the same way, after leaving religion, we can actually feel its absence in a way that's different than never having experienced its presence. And so I call that the existential chasm, right? You're facing these existential fears afresh. But for many people, you don't have those answers. And depending on how you were raised, you may not have been taught how to develop the skills or motivations to learn those on your own if you were raised in like a high authoritarian religion, right? People just told you what to believe and you're like, cool, I can do that. But if you don't have that now, it's like, well, how do I assemble my worldview? So what happens is people usually simultaneously experience negative things like grief, fear, anxiety, and also like positive things like freedom and awe and curiosity. And it's like this push and this pull of feeling awesome, but also feeling terrified, right? It's kind of like feeling untethered. For some people, feeling untethered feels great. Like for me, feeling untethered feels a little, I don't know, like sometimes I like to be tethered. how that intersects with religious residue is if religion persists after you leave, and people are really existentially, I would call, vulnerable right after they leave, they could be more prone to being taken advantage of by people with malevolent intent who want to manipulate them and step in as new religious leaders. Like my wife, as a therapist, literally has had people tell her, now that I'm no longer religious and I don't know what to believe, you tell me what to believe. And she's like, I can't do that. I'm a therapist. It's against my ethics. Like, there's no way I'm going to do that. But other people who want to make money or who want power and status would be more than happy to step in. And I'm not saying like tell you, but like fill that role for many people who have left religion. And so part of what I hope to spread the word for people who have left religion is I want them to be aware and to interrogate, what am I doing because it's religious residue? And what am I doing because it's an authentic part of my identity and I'm acting with integrity with my values. So yeah, thanks so much for sharing. I think that's, it maps on a lot to some other things that we've seen other people say.
No.
Thank you so much. It's awesome. Before we go on, and Kim, I'm going to ask you to do the intro in a moment. Anybody else has a note? Because I saw so many very deeply kind of pensive faces where we were talking about religious residue. It seemed like a lot of memories came to your mind, a lot of thoughts. If you have anything that you want to share, please jump in. I'm going to stop the intro round for a moment. I'll share one then while you're thinking. So yeah, I was Catholic for a period in my life, and I will share more during my intro. And the one thing that remained with me from my religious years is gratitude at meal times. And I don't know what to do with it, but I'm just so grateful to be on this earth and being provided for by myself or my host or the restaurant. And I feel a bit weird about this because I would feel very strange praying because I no longer believe in who I would be praying to. But nevertheless, as a human being part of this system where I'm given this pleasure and nourishment multiple times a day without really having to do anything for it. Like I don't have to have to hunt, gather, sow or harvest. It's kind of insane, you know? And I feel that a lot. And sometimes also when I encounter some types of technology, I'm so grateful for the human mind to build these things and improve these things. I mean, walking around New York City, and there was a very interesting Twitter debate about this. Like half of the people were commenting that it makes them feel small. And for me, it makes me feel great. Like we built this, you know, and that we are all the same. Like everybody is capable of contributing their own in their own small way. And to me, this is a profoundly spiritual experience to call yourself a citizen of the world and be part of this and get this opportunity. But I feel that without religion, it kind of either becomes this new agey thing, or it becomes very trippy, or some kind of communist manifesto that I would definitely not sign. And so there's nothing to do with it. I mean, I don't know if you guys do gratitude journaling, but like gratitude toward whom, you know? It's there are a lot of open questions there. Anyone else has had a similar experience of some love having nowhere to go?
I think it's interesting, and it kind of makes me wonder, like maybe there's sort of different emotional textures to religious residue. Like, well, two thoughts, right? Like one, like I hear your point and kind of gratitude and kind of feeling, I guess, sort of powerful and vast. And for me, that comment made me realize, like, one flavor of religious residue I have is sort of when I feel fear or anxiety. You know, there's something soothing about the act of vocalizing a prayer that I remember from my childhood, even if I don't believe like the like the words of it any one bit. And I realize now, and when I used to own a car, like I would say a quick prayer every time before I drove, just you know, because part of it is like you're kind of at the mercy of the road and like all these things outside of control, something like that. The other thing that comes to mind from your comment, Anna, is like, yeah, like this broad question of, is like a secular spirituality even possible? Like, is it possible to feel a sense of the sublime or a sense of transcendence without any kind of like underpinning religious sort of backing? Because like I almost feel like if you like, stopped a random self-identifying as atheist person on the street and to sort of probe them on their like on their values and on their interests and kind of what brings them joy, like why does nature matter to you, why does music matter to you, like beyond some number of whys, you kind of get to some liminal I don't know space, which still feels religious in nature even if they don't explicitly describe it that way. Yeah, just some thoughts I want to share.
So the highs and the lows, we don't know what.
Yeah.
Maybe we could probably create some kind of historicizing argument that it's because our highs and our lows are so kind of softened by living in a highly symbolic society, we have less need, right? I mean, if you read John Donne, how he went from a Don Juan to a deep religious person, I mean, he buried 10 of his 12 kids, right? You lived in a world of constant grief.
Yeah.
And it's complete nonsense when they say like, oh, people got used to burying their kids. No, they did not. Like, read absolutely anybody. Like, it was a very, very different experience, whereby today, if you live, in a upper middle class family in the West, you might not encounter real grief until your 50s, 60s, 70s, right? Just because of how safe our lives have become. And so that's a very different existence as well. Kim, should we open the floor for you? Welcome.
Sure, thanks. My name is Kim. So I probably don't have a lot new to offer here. A lot of what people have shared sounds familiar. So I will share with you that I live in St. George, Utah, and no, I'm not LDS. We're actually closer to Vegas than we are to Salt Lake City, so that should give you some idea. It's funny. I look at LDS members, and I think they have a great sense of community. So they're all about the family. They're all about, so I mean, you see large families, you see these social networks. And at one time I thought, maybe I should just become LDS just for the community, but yeah, that didn't last very long. I was like, no, I can't do that. So like Katrina, I was baptized in the Catholic Church, attended Catholic schools through the 12th grade. I actually kind of lost my religion when I was in high school and never really realized I was an atheist until much later. Sort of. So I think so. One thing that I thought about when Katrina mentioned that she was getting married is a lot of my friends shared with me that their parents had stopped going to church, but when they had children, they started up again. And I always found that interesting. And I was like, well, why would they do that? And it's like, because they needed to teach their children some kind of morality or thing like that. And I just thought that was very interesting. As far as myself and why I'm here, I'm just a sucker for anything that has to do with religion. I don't know what I believe, to be honest with you. I don't know. Some days I think there's a creator, sometimes I don't. Some days I think it just doesn't matter. I think, and going through this phase right now where I'm more focused on how can I flourish? So just, it doesn't really matter, but how can I flourish as a human being? And it's some part of me wonders if the problems that we're seeing today are because there are more nones and dones. Have we lost our moorings or something? I don't know. It just seems to me like you don't need religion to be morality. I think morality preceded religion. So it's like, but what's going on? I don't understand. So that's pretty much it.
It sounds to me that you have not lost any bit of the curiosity. If anything, you have more and more of curiosity toward religion. This is something that I noticed amongst my friends who are dones, that a lot of times there is a kind of more militantly atheistic period right after religiosity, when you really have to kind of mark your territory and really a little bit more vehemently redefine yourself and separate yourself from something you used to believe in. And then there's a softening, or at least a curiosity and maybe self-forgiveness, that I used to be that person and then I changed and it's fine. And other people have another course of the process. Daryl, do you have any notes on maybe not even realizing at first that you have become an atheist?
Yeah. I mean, what you're describing, some people leave religion and kind of like they know when they left, right? There's like, oh, like this is it. I can't take it. I'm out of here. It's like a big kind of exit. And other people, like one of my friends said, he just, to use a metaphor, he said he just kept moving further and further and further down the seat until he realized he was no longer sitting at the table. And he was just like, oh, like, and for him, it didn't feel like a huge loss because each of the shifts was just kind of congruent with his values. And then one day he realized, I guess I'm just not religious anymore. And so it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be, for some people, it is a big thing, kind of like for some people, like a conversion experience is a big emotional experience. And then for others, that deconversion or de-identification is a big emotional process. But then for others, it's just kind of, they slowly have kind of shifted. I have heard similar things about people returning or either returning when they have kids or kind of trying to figure out how to navigate what to do with having kids. Because on the one hand, not everyone, but some people will say, yeah, I'm not religious and I don't really like religion, but there was something kind of nice about some aspects of the religion that I'd probably be okay if my kids got a little bit of, right? And so it's this tricky thing, like, well, we if religion taught some morals that we're kind of okay with, but we aren't okay with these other beliefs, right? We aren't okay with these other values. And so trying to navigate that with a partner can sometimes be really stressful, especially if you and your partner aren't on the same page, or trying to figure out how to do some of the stuff that religion did for kids can be kind of a tricky task.
I mean, the moral aspect, right, that the parent has to represent in front of their children. And I can imagine that whilst it might feel very limiting, if the child is misbehaving and then the father or the mother says, don't do that, and the child asks why, there might be a more kind of stabilizing answer coming from a religious parent compared with somebody who's just like, it's not nice, right?
Yeah.
Or at least you have to be very much kind of espousing the golden rule and really approach it from an empathetic point of view, where you just want to teach your child that treat other people like you would want to be treated.
Right. And like keying into like what level of both cognitive and moral development is your kid at, right? Like, can you explain the nuances of, well, animals evolved in such a way that morals signal inclusion and belonging in groups. So if you continue to act like that, you're going to be ostracized. So you're not going to have any opportunities to reproduce or be in a group, and will probably be eaten by a predator. It's like they're free. And so it's a lot easier to be like, if you do that, it's bad and wrong because we have these rules that say it's bad and wrong. You know what I'm saying? So
sure, some parents at Interintellect have those conversations with their.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
Let's
Yeah.
talk about group evolutionary processes.
Yeah.
And
You don't want to be a free rider. Yeah.
algorithm.
That's right. Don't be a free rider, Billy. And that's tough because that kind of goes over kids' heads, which sometimes is like why people leave religion, is because this is like a strange thing, because if churches, if part of what they are doing are trying to engage in moral education, they kind of have to pitch to the middle. And so some people who are kind of like in different levels of cognitive or moral development say like, that's way too basic for me. You're losing so much nuance. But right, so it's this weird tension, but it's also like a way of getting some of the earlier people, or people earlier in those developmental stages, to understand what's going on and talk in a frame that makes sense.
My advice is just like talk about, the Homo sapiens' journey with your kids and see what happens. See what happens.
Yeah, perfect.
Stone tools, you won, This is wonderful. Yeah, I mean, this is the whole this is the actual group evolution argument, right? That religions are a shortcut, that they evolved so you don't have to explain certain things to everybody all the time. And then, of course, you have a lot of variations to this, right? Like in Mormonism, you have to have this thing where you feel it, right? In Judaism, you have to have the obligation of every individual to think through the world from the Genesis, right? There's no spiritual bypassing. You have to go through the entire agony. And yeah, I mean, Christianity is all about skin in the game. In Buddhism, you have to actually do your own meditation. It's not enough to just like read about the Buddha. But nevertheless, when it comes to moral commandments, it's a shortcut. I remember when the DAO started and everybody started building neighborhoods and co-living communities and new cities, and they were trying to compose all these kind of codes of conduct for their in like little town. At the beginning, they were very naive, and I always asked them like, what are you going to be doing when people will start being people, after the honeymoon period of having moved a bunch of people together into the same place? And they basically started reinventing the 10 commandments. And I felt, you actually have these rules already. Like, don't kill people, don't steal stuff, don't sleep with each other's wives, and you'll be fine. Like, this is a how not to murder each other list, the original kind of code of conduct. But it feels like every community, wants to invent their own 10 commandments, basically. And not being religious leaves you no choice, because you can't just adopt the shortcut. So I'm sure there would be an economic argument for not wasting time on reinventing things that were already figured out. But that would not feel intellectually satisfying to everybody, I'm sure. Jenny, Mark, do you want to grab the mic?
Sure.
Hi, great to see you.
Yeah. You too. Thanks for doing this. I love the title and word done or dones. I really resonate with that. I would consider myself a done. I'm someone, I did grow up in a kind of secular agnostic Jewish family, but I also grew up in the 1970s and 80s in California. And so I was very surrounded by all kinds of New Age spirituality, which is, kind of everywhere, but it certainly was a big part of my upbringing, both in my family and what I was exposed to. And so I'm definitely, I would have described myself as, spiritual, but not religious. I would have described myself as kind of like a nun, but now I'm a done. I'm kind of not spiritual and not religious, I'd say, at least not in the way I used to use that word. And I think one thing that can be tricky about different kinds of New Age spirituality is, first of all, it's hard to define because it's such a hodgepodge of, a little Buddhism, a little Hinduism, astrology, reincarnation, enlightenment, alternative medicine, mysticism, cosmic consciousness. All these things go into it. And so it's a hodgepodge, and no one really thinks they are New Agey, like it's out there, that is New Agey. So it's very hard to both define or to know that it's something you left or something you have. And also because the tentacles are so widespread in mainstream culture. I think I read a survey, I don't know if this is true, but I read this, that maybe in the UK, that I don't know, a huge percentage of people who self-identify as atheists actually do have some of these supernatural New Agey beliefs, whether it's in reincarnation. So some of these beliefs. So it's something that's very pervasive. And when I started to leave all that behind, I really saw a lot of parallels between it and like other kinds of religious fundamentalism, like Christian fundamentalism. You know, you don't think of it that way, but there are a lot of similarities in terms of like the dogma of certain kinds of beliefs and you know, afterlife, and you know, you could consider enlightenment like heaven, and you know, your ego like hell or something. You know, so there's like a lot of similarities. And I think those beliefs did give me a lot of kind of comfort and a sense of magic and the transcendent. And so, and for me, letting go of them came quite suddenly. It was one of those loss of faith experiences where one pillar of one belief fell down. And then I was like, what else am I wrong about? And it was like almost overnight, everything falling away, and a total kind of shift there, which is challenging because it makes you realize, whoa, how many of my beliefs are actually totally unexamined, you know, and I just kind of believed it because it felt good, or I was told it. And also I think what was challenging, and I think this certainly happens in evangelical Christianity, in all organized religions, but also in New Age kind of communities, is there can be a very kind of controlling cultish dynamic in a lot of these things. And so leaving can be challenging too for that reason, because it's sort of like you're then in an out group or something like that, you know. But that kind of loss of spirituality that happened with me, one kind of silver lining of it is it really opened me up to learning more about philosophy. And in the US, philosophy is not taught in schools, like in high school. Most high schools, you don't learn it. And I never took a class on it in college, so I was just never exposed. And when I started getting into it, I was like, wow, there's another way to kind of grapple with life's bigger questions, aside, other than religion, other than spirituality. And so that's been really gratifying. And even, you know, like Shahid was saying about experiences of the sublime or the transcendent, I think for me personally, not everybody maybe has a need for that, but I like those experiences. And I think there are other ways through art and fiction and nature and people to have those kinds of experiences.
Want me to go ahead, or I think somebody else wants to comment? Sure. My story is actually quite similar in terms of the background that I have. And I, too, grew up in a similar situation where, to me, a secular Jewish family, my mother was a Holocaust survivor, and so religion was important to her. My father, religion was not so important, so I felt often kind of caught in the crosshairs, and more like an outsider in the religion than as something that gave me either faith or belonging. But later I wanted that belonging. And so I too got into kind of new agey, personal growth, self-help things back like in the 80s and 90s. And then I think while I was in that, tried to have a lot of spiritual beliefs, and at different times I did, but I was in, because like Jenny said, they pull from so many different traditions. It's easy to kind of walk through that sort of new age spiritual path and not be really clear what you believe, which makes you very vulnerable to bad influences. And like, well, this conception of God or reality sounded good that day, but then today this one sounds good. And so something happened to me where I realized that there were a lot of things going on that didn't line up with my true values. And then I started questioning my beliefs as well. And I realized I had been looking for a transcendent sort of ideology for a long time. And none of them worked because they all were too simplistic, I think, and cut corners, tried to take away sort of the pain of being human and form an in-group and an out-group. People say these things about religion too. I think just human beings tend to do that. And I had to pull back. And I realized that I don't believe in God. But I think that the idea of spirituality is very interesting. And it depends how you define it. For me, I would say I have had more spiritual beliefs since...
You're experiencing?
Yeah, sorry. More spiritual experiences since leaving all of that behind. Through things like studying philosophy, creativity, meditation, psychedelics, all kinds of things. So I actually feel now often like there's more magic and mystery in the universe, although I'm not a believer in either God or a particular religious faith. And the one thing that I do miss, I think, is having a sense of community. And that's where I feel like our culture is, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, falling short. It's like if you are part of a religion, I think it does give you a sense of identity and belonging that you're sort of out on your own without that. So I am seeking that. But I find life overall has more color and more magic. And I'm so interested now in the different beliefs people have. And it's funny, you hear the term like militant atheist. And what comes to me is somebody who's like dogmatic in the same way that some fundamentalists can be, of like, okay, this is what it is, and I feel the opposite. Like I have my either belief or lack of belief, but I'm fascinated by people who see the world differently from me and have different beliefs and what those beliefs do for them. So, and I love this conversation as well about flourishing, which I think is what everybody's looking for. And throughout all of my travels and different belief systems and being in groups and out of groups, flourishing is what I've been trying to achieve. So.
Yeah, I think that's, not to jump in, but like I think that's actually a question that I'd love to spend some time on, having not picked up the book yet. Like when you talk about that half of kind of the equation, okay, stories and like leaving and then landing somewhere, what does the flourishing look like or mean, or how do you kind of think about that as a, I don't know, way of being or a verb or however you want to talk about that? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think it kind of ties into with Jenny and Mark's story. Part of what y'all are saying is all of us humans are trying to answer big existential questions, right? Like that's kind of the stirring that's under the hood, is that there are these existential motivations that are leading us to try to come up with answers to some of life's deepest questions. Religion is one way of doing that, but it's not the only way of doing that. And you can find those answers outside of religion. So, when some people leave religion, I mentioned a William James quote in the comments. He's got this great quote that a great many people think they are thinking when they're merely rearranging their prejudices. Like, I love that, because it's kind of like, if you leave one type of fundamentalist ideology, you can become a, fundamentalist in another fashion, whether that's in politics or a different religion or in being non-religious. And so how does it look to flourish? Like, what does flourishing look like? I think it looks like a few things. I mean, in my sense, it looks a bit like, how are you going to address the big, pressing, perennial existential questions that we all face? So things like, who am I? What meaning does life have, or what meaning does my life have? How do I come to terms with death? How do I come to terms with isolation? How do I make decisions in a world where there's no clear guidance on what the best outcome or right or wrong might be? And so I think assembling some type of framework for addressing those existential questions is one of those pillars in trying to cultivate meaning. I think a second is to try to craft an identity that is consistent with your values and allows you to live with authenticity. And so a lot of times when people leave religion, their identity is defined by no longer being religious. And so they identify with other, like, recently non-religious or kind of religious duns, and they get together, and what they say is they're trauma bonding, but what's actually called is they're co-ruminating. And they're like, oh, wasn't it the worst? I can't believe that this, we got out of there, and they're sharing their survivor stories, which is fine for a bit. But if you spend your whole time looping around that type of identity, you're still being defined by the very thing you didn't want to define your identity anymore, right? By religion. But rather than being religious, you're being defined as being or kind of formerly religious. So I think crafting a meaningful identity, and then I think navigating social relationships. And many of you have said the thing that you're kind of missing, or you notice other people miss, are community. And so how do you find a community that is going to be there for you, that is somewhat ideologically similar, but you don't want to be so ideologically homogeneous, that you're not open to new ideas. And how do you navigate relationships with people in your life who don't agree with or don't understand your religious change, right? If you were raised in a religious household or have a religious family, it might be pretty hard for you to have them understand that you're a different person than you were then, and this is not, just some type of adolescent spiritual temper tantrum. Your religious views have changed, right? You're not just going through a phase. So I think those are a few of the initial things, like addressing those questions, crafting an identity, and kind of forming a social network. And then, if to the degree that some people have experienced religious and spiritual trauma and abuse, dealing with that with like someone who's trained and a licensed therapist to help you with that can be a way of kind of moving toward healing.
Thank you so much, Daryl. And I have a couple of follow-up questions, but first, just something that came up a couple of times, and I never really thought about this. I mean, I thought about this in a political sense, but never in a religious sense. When people don't yet know what they are, but other people might be able to help them define themselves. So people not realizing that they have become Christians or they have become atheists. I mean, in politics, we always have this, like somebody doesn't identify as a right-wing person, but in other people's eyes, they seem so, and then who's right? What is your take on this? Like, can you be, for how long can we be confused about what we are religiously, and how can we give other people around us the power to tell us where we are on the spectrum?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I probably tend to err a little bit on the side of autonomy. So if people aren't quite sure what you are, that's okay. I also know we're living in a time when at least with my students, they're like, don't define me, don't put me in a box. If I want to define myself, I'll put myself in my own box, but even that's too confining. So I think we can listen to others and we can take the feedback. If they're like, hey, you're acting in these ways, would it be helpful for you if you realize that these are some of your behaviors? Are you aware that this is what you're doing or saying or thinking or believing? Does that provide any clarity to you so that can help you sort out your identity? And then allowing that person to kind of come by it honestly and by their own volition, I think could be pretty powerful.
Thank you so much. The other thing that came up, and I think maybe we discussed this when we were at this Templeton Foundation conference together a couple of months back. I went to Luke Burgess's conference last November, and Peter Thiel gave a talk. And obviously the whole thing was designed to provoke the whole group gathered there. But one of his funniest sentences in the speech was, I am religious, but not spiritual. Kind of to kind of jab at what everybody else is saying. How do we define the difference between being spiritual and religious? It feels like every person that I meet has a completely different or a very confused dichotomy in their minds. Is there an official definition?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the way I think about it is that spirituality is someone's perceived connection or relationship with whatever they consider to be transcendent or divine or larger than themselves, right? So that feeling of connection. Religion is just one of many ways people can engage in their spirituality, right? So it's like an organized framework for facilitating spirituality. But people can experience their spirituality outside of religion. So they can experience it by being in nature. I remember when I saw the Northern Lights one time, it was such a moving experience to me. It felt like the most, Mark, maybe kind of like you're saying, like the most deeply spiritual experience I can remember. And it was me and my wife in an abandoned parking lot 2 hours outside of Reykjavik in Iceland, staring up at the sky at 2 a.m, right? Like it was just kind of me and nature. People can experience spirituality with other humans, kind of like the goodness of humanity, kind of by taking in the cosmos, or kind of like the vastness of the universe and kind of the ineffable nature of all existence. Or they can experience it by living in authentic ways to themselves, right? That kind of create that sense of spirituality from a sense of authentic integrity within themselves. So spirituality is that felt connection to something larger than themselves. Religion is kind of an organized way to facilitate or channel. So it's like spirituality is the electricity, religion is the conduit or the way to kind of direct it.
Is there anybody here? Thank you so much, Daryl. That's a really beautiful and memorable way of creating the distinction. I will never, people always remember the story. So I will remember you and your wife at 2 a.m. outside Reykjavik, looking up at the sky. Once, oh, there's a strange sound in my apartment. Sorry about that. I think it's some kind of alarm system outside. Any notes? Anybody here who identifies as religious but not spiritual? Peter Thiel would be so disappointed. It's actually quite rare, right? I think you have to be very much an kind of in a provocative mood to say that. Another thing that kept coming up, and this is really one of the gists here, I think, of the matter is, the in-group, out-group idea. I so often feel that that's one thing that people tend to be really wrong about. I think we are very bad at modeling who will actually exclude us socially. We tend to be super anxious about things that then don't matter. And we disregard things that will actually get us into a far worse status or position in a community. Daryl, is it the same across all religions, how in-groups, out-groups work? And is there kind of static definition thereof that gives some kind of grounding to people's perceived, the sense of danger, the fear of rejection that we all feel as humans?
Yeah, so we humans kind of naturally create in-groups and out-groups. There are these wild studies that were done in social psychology using something called the minimal group paradigm, where they would literally either flip a coin, or they'd have people guess how many dots they saw on a screen, and based on these things they were put into groups, and just by hanging out and being in a group you favor your group more than the other group, even though your assignment to this group was completely arbitrary or random. And so we would kind of naturally ascribe to these categories. It can be worsened though when you're in a religious group or an ideological group where your membership is contingent on expressing very publicly viewable behavior, right? And we see this in religion, we see these in politics now, right? You have to be you have to have certain behaviors and mark certain expressions in political groups in order to be enough. And the reason for that, according to some, is because our self-esteem is tied to our group standing, right? Our self-esteem is a barometer of whether or not we're included. Well, why on earth should we ever care about being included, or if our group likes us or accepts us? Well, kind of not really jokingly, kind of going back to the evolutionary argument, if you're excluded, that's a huge threat to your existence. Both you're more likely to be picked off by predators back in the day, and you're much less likely to be able to have opportunities for reproduction, both of which are evolutionary imperatives. And so from an evolutionary perspective, being excluded is extremely threatening. And so I think we're in a cultural moment where our out groups and in groups are very harshly defined, and we're completely fine hunting people out of one group kind of by our own discretion. In the United States, after 2016, after that election, people's families got ruptured based on who voted for whom, and things got kind of worse in 2020. And so I do think that religion catalyzes that, but it's working on a natural feature of the human mind. It didn't invent those things.
Thank you so much for that note. And yeah, I mean, if you were the kind of odd one out in your tribe, you didn't get food, right? So it's not just access to reproduction, it's access to, I mean, people were hunting and gathering in groups, right?
Yeah.
And we feel it. I mean, the shame and the fear of rejection in your body is the biggest overreaction you will ever feel in your life. We have a far better way of controlling lust, fear, other powerful, overwhelming emotions. Rejection makes you lose your mind. I mean, people do the dumbest, most overreactive things because it's a life and death question. And I'm pretty sure that we could dig down and find out that even today, it is actually a life and death question, right? We have some research to show that it's not the talented artists that become the stars, it's the popular artists. How many friends do you have? How desirable people find you, et cetera, et cetera. So social competency you're not going to starve to death, but you will have far better opportunities if you manage to not be socially excluded. So we talked a little bit about some of the core ideas in the book, religious residues, existential chasms. I would love to talk a little bit about your theory of the four horsemen, and not in the Gottman way, but in the religious Van Tongeren way. What are the four reasons why people would leave a religion? And I would love to just go through them if you don't mind. And anybody here in the group who has a story or something resonates, please do jump in. This is not a TED Talk. This is an Interintellect salon. I will do the same.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, so I call these the four horsemen of religion's apocalypse, like not because it's ushering in the apocalypse, but I think it might be spelling the apocalypse for certain versions of religion. So the first reason why people are leaving is because of something I call cultural stagnation. So that is, people are getting more progressive, but their institutions or their organizations are not. So people might be getting, more progressive about ideologies around LGBTQ affirming beliefs, around sexuality, around gender, around race and ethnicity, but institutions are not. And so they're seeing that gap, and they're saying, well, I don't want to be associated with an institution or organization that doesn't affirm these values. I've grown, I've changed, I have these intellectual beliefs that you're not mapping onto or keeping up with, I'm out. So it's kind of like intellectual value-driven reasons. The second reason is religious or spiritual abuse or trauma. So they've either witnessed it from afar, right? Like, oh, what the priests in the Catholic Church did was horrible. I don't want to be part of that. Or they themselves have experienced it either firsthand or kind of know people in their own lives who have experienced religious or spiritual abuse or trauma. A third is what I call thin views of suffering. So by this, I mean, when people are taught religious beliefs that can't make sense of suffering or theodicy, like the problem of evil, because they're taught things like toxic positivity or the prosperity gospel, or like it's kind of religious expressions of the just world hypothesis. So good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Well, when something bad happens to me, what does that mean about me? Does that mean that I'm bad? Or if you've been believed in an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent supernatural agent, is that agent no longer all-knowing, all-powerful, or all good? Or are they just kind of mean and they're laughing at me because I've been, smote with some type of struck down with some type of suffering? And then the fourth, and so what we need is like thicker views of suffering. Like someone mentioned, like suffering is a human universal. Wouldn't it be awesome if we actually had religious beliefs in which the idea was like there's this supernatural agent that walks with you with your suffering, not that is responsible for it. And then the fourth is a problematic label. So some people just don't like the term religion or religious, and especially in the US, they don't like the term evangelical, particularly following 2016. And in fact, I think it was like 2 years ago, they did a poll that 40% of self-identified evangelicals do not believe in the deity of Jesus. They don't believe that Jesus is God. I'm not a theologian, but I'm pretty sure that was like the central tenet of being an evangelical. And so if they don't believe that, then what that's suggesting is at least 2/5 of people who identify in the US as evangelicals do so for political or socio-political reasons, right? It's a socio-political term. It's not a religious one. And so some people are like, if that's what it means to be religious, I'm out. So those map onto kind of research in various strains, that those are kind of four major reasons why people might leave religion. And I'd love to hear if that's kind of your experience, or if you have other ones, or you're like, you have all of those.
I would love to hear from the group. Any stories about the four horsemen? Toxic positivity.
One that comes to mind for me, I think perhaps not like theodicy as the issue, but the issue of like promises being fulfilled. I think I very much came from a world of like prophecy and like God is going to do things in the future and we're going to change the world, and this season is now going to bring about change, and we're on the brink of everyone now joining the thing that we're a part of, because we're right. Everyone will naturally join and become one with us. And just like saw that play out so many times that not happen that it kind of became a like, oh, this is not, yeah, like it became difficult to then like the next time that was stated say like, okay, what's happening here? Because the past 5 times we've said this, like it hasn't happened, or the past 20 years of talking about this that hasn't happened, or 200 years, etc. So that I relate to that as an idea.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Personally, it was very much like, sorry, go ahead.
No, just religions have to be very careful not to put exact dates on things that might happen in the time of that individual, because then it gets embarrassing very fast.
For me, I think it's very much a like problematic label question leading into a cultural stagnation. I think like I think when you grow up Muslim and like 9/11 happens when you're 7 years old, or you just sort of begin questioning a lot of these things like very, very young. And then it kind of led to just like this process of like having reconciling certain I guess intellectual beliefs about society and how how the world works and how things should be structured versus what is seemingly taught to you. And yeah, and a part of that was sort of a little bit of mental gymnastics along the way, I think, where you kind of see something like, well, maybe like most people who take on these label do these things, but actually like the crux of the religion says something else, so everyone's doing it wrongly. And I'm sure I'm not the first one to kind of like have experienced this sort of pattern, but yeah, just sort of sharing that the cultural stagnation horseman was most, I think, relevant to me particularly.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for sharing, for being vulnerable around that.
Yeah. Nice.
I recently read an interview. I don't know, we were discussing doing a salon on Anne Rice, and everybody identifies Anne Rice as like the Catholic novelist in America, and Interview with the Vampire and all these books have such a strong Christian theme, and the redemption theme is so strongly there. And then I found this article about her from 2012, and she actually like very loudly left the Catholic Church because of the abuse allegations. And it was just such a humbling moment to read her first thoughts at the time, as somebody who writes about all these children character being in the care of adults with a very strong Catholic theme, and then that coming up, it's like the most vulnerable point of the fabric is where the abuse happens. And I really respected the intellectual honesty of it. And you can imagine that somebody doing this in old age, they have to basically reverse engineer their entire lives, and how hard it must be. I think I loved this note. I even wrote it down. What Colby, you said, I can't cause myself to believe. That was also how I left religion. And, in weak moments, you wish that you could go back, but you can't. And you can't cheat yourself. And I have the deepest respect toward people who are able to believe, and maybe my life would be better, but that's what we have, right? The same way as I'm not 6 feet tall and I never will be. It's just like you have to deal with it. And if I'm at a concert, I have to go to the front because otherwise I can't see anything. This is how life is. I'm going to do my intro actually while I have the mic. I was born into a completely secular family. I had no idea what Jewishness meant at the time, so that was a surprise. But independently, my grandparents were communists, so they were massively anti-religion for a long time. But I had a conversion experience, and I converted to Roman Catholicism when I was 12. It was my own decision, my own will, my own epiphany, my own understanding. Later on, I realized that it was almost an ad hoc thing that I had my experience of the transcendental in a Catholic church. I think if it had been in a mosque or in a Buddhist temple, I would have converted to that religion. It took me then I went to Catholic school, and as I was like deepening my theological studies, I realized that this kind of sacredness is there in all religions, and I started questioning not the validity of the numinous experience, but the validity of claiming that only your church has it. And I felt that that was insanely disrespectful toward other people, also bordering on just ignorant. In my school, there was almost like a ban on learning about other religions, lest you find out this secret. But then I also had a kind of new atheist period when I started studying science more seriously, and came face to face with a lot of the contradictions that I couldn't solve. And then it softened, right? You don't have to, if you have to aggressively reject an idea, you're not really rejecting it, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't need the aggression. And there was definitely a metaphor there for myself. Before we close out, I mean, and I really don't want to like end on a negative note, so we will do a proper outro, but I would love to hear more, Daryl, about your studies into religious trauma. I remember the first time I heard this phrase about when we were at this conference, I didn't even know this was acknowledged and it existed as a kind of separate field of psychological care and research. Do you want to speak about this a little bit, and what is the spectrum where an event in somebody's life qualifies as a religious trauma, and maybe something where a layperson might claim that this was a religious trauma, but professionals don't accept it as such, and if so, why?
Yeah. So it's these are thorny issues, and so when we're thinking about religious trauma, we're thinking about an event or some type of extremely abusive or harmful event that occurs kind of at the hands of religious leaders, or via religious means, or because of religious institutions. And it usually happens to people who are vulnerable and kind of seeking help, right? So there's usually like a power differential in which a religious leader or someone associated with religion acts in a way or through religious means to exploit or hurt or take advantage of to someone who's vulnerable. And so, I mean, these types of events range on intensity and degree, and I would certainly never want to invalidate somebody's pain if they've been hurt by this type of experience. But there probably are differences between religious hurt and then religious trauma, right? Like, I think some people could be hurt by their religion, they could be frustrated, they could be disappointed, they could be kind of angry or mad at their religion, and even choose, to vehemently disagree with their religion. And yet still those might be qualitatively different than experiences of religious trauma or abuse, right? So kind of, if we're thinking about the survivors of the abuse scandal within the Catholic Church, that's religious trauma, right? Those people have been traumatized, and more than just religiously traumatized. There's a number of other things going on there. And so, I think there's some research that suggests it might be, religious settings where there's like a highly narcissistic leader, and one in which there's not a lot of control or a lot of checks for keeping that person from just completely being in control, can often give way to be more likely to perpetuate religious abuse and trauma. And so where there's high control, there's a narcissistic leader, it's kind of an insular community where people are encouraged to downplay questioning or doubts. Those can all be recipes for situations where religious trauma can be more likely to occur.
You mentioned earlier that sometimes we just witness another person suffering in a religious context. I mean, provided that this is not a major cult situation where you have to like call a deprogrammer, and it's something that might happen in a more everyday scenario, what can we do if we observe somebody that we know undergoing religious trauma? Is it our place even? I mean, obviously, I would say it is, right? Because you can't just observe human suffering and not do anything about it.
Yeah.
How does that conversation start? What is it?
Yeah. What do you do? I mean, I think one of the things you could do is you could first go to the person that you think is kind of being subject to this abuse or trauma and check in with them, ask how they're doing. Check in with them, say, are you okay? Here's what I saw. Here's what I'm observing. Are you okay? Make sure that they're okay. You can reach out to their other support, friends and family. Ask, does this person seem like they're safe? Do they feel like this is an okay situation? But really, if you've witnessed something that that is not right, if you've witnessed something that is abuse or perpetuating trauma, there are numbers you can call. Like, you can report this type of abuse. I've got a few resources in my book. You could kind of bring forth your concern to the leadership of an organization and let them know. And depending on the organization, they may or may not be receptive to hearing that some member of their organization, might have engaged in some type of behavior that might be wrong. And so, but checking in with that person and making sure that they're safe and caring for their needs, maybe getting them connected with a therapist, and then also connecting and contacting authorities would be kind of important steps.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask. Like, if we try to connect with the person and they are not owning up to it, are there like hotlines that you can call and direct attention to somebody, I don't know, about to harm themselves, or like what, or just being, losing like basically their ability to live a full normal human life?
Right. No, there are goodness, yeah, there are hotlines. In the book I kind of mentioned. So, for example, there's the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline. There's a National Sexual Assault Hotline. Right, both of those would be if you're kind of thinking that physical or sexual abuse is being perpetrated. Contacting a therapist, or seeing if this person would be amenable to seeing a therapist, or making a police report if really kind of what you're witnessing is illegal, illicit, or against the law or harmful to some individual. Contacting authorities is better safe than not doing anything, than being a bystander and having people continue to be hurt.
And I think just telling people that there is something called, or categorized as like religious crisis therapy, that there are, I didn't know before we first had our conversation in San Diego that this existed, but it makes so much sense, of course, but you never hear about it. It's not something where like Esther Perel is in my feed all the time.
Yeah, right.
People having, relationship crisis with a religion, but it happens a lot.
Right. There are trained therapists who have been trained in how to help people with religious abuse and trauma, and seeking out one of those trained therapists can go a long way.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and the fruits of your labors here through your research and the years of work. Any questions, guys, that we might not have covered or answered? You probably will get a homework as opposed to like a full conversation. But I will leave just a couple of minutes. I saw a lot of people taking notes and just being deep in thought. I think, obviously you're spending your Wednesday night here. So you came for a reason. Is there any question that wasn't answered or addressed? Wow, then Daryl, you did a good job.
I mean, I'm so grateful. Thank you all so much for having me, for engaging in this conversation. Very, very kind. It was so enjoyable.
And recommend it to people so that the world knows that this whole area of inquiry and support exists. People don't necessarily know. And if somebody's fear of living a religion is because they feel that they will be so alone, rest assured how many ex-evangelicals find each other and become friends, and there is a huge support network, and it's an entire field of giving communal and psychological help to people who have gone through it. Daryl, you're doing such important work. I'm so happy that I came across it. I'm learning so much. And thank you everybody for joining. and for the, the beautiful, vulnerable questions and stories that you chose to share. We will save the chat, so all the links will be shared. And we have a Discord channel on the Interintellect Discord called Religious Practice, where we actually talk about atheism as well and ex-religiosity. And you're very welcome to continue the conversation there. And if you wake up tomorrow with the best question, but you forgot to ask, I'm sure we can email Daryl or find him on Twitter, and he will be amenable to responding to it. Thank you so much, everybody. Are we okay with publishing the video? Let's do it. Let's tell the world.
Yeah.
I'll do just that. Thank you so much. Have a lovely rest of the evening.
Yeah.
And I very
Thank
soon.
you.
Take care.
Love y'all. Have
Bye-bye.
a good one.